Well, there was no real doubt that they wouldn't arrive on time, but now all Australians can safely be assured their tax cuts will come from the 1st of July. The Stage 3 revamp by the Albanese government is law, or will be as soon as the Governor-General signs off on it, because the Senate briskly passed the package within the last 24 hours. There was no delay, as the Prime Minister and others predicted there could be, and it gives the government something to talk about in the remaining days of the Dunkley by-election, as more and more voters in that Melbourne seat turn out to cast their ballots early. We'll look at this and more today. We're live from Parliament House, acknowledging traditional custodians of land in the capital. I'm Jennett. You're watching Afternoon Briefing. And a little later this hour, for the 2 years of the war in Ukraine, the one constant has been the complete refusal by NATO allies to put their ground forces on the ground in Ukraine. Now, there are obvious reasons for this, the main one being it could pitch Russia into a pan-European war of countless cost. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has suggested nothing should now be ruled out, and although he's been shut down by fellow European leaders, some analysts think it's a threat worth floating, if only to unsettle Vladimir Putin. We'll talk to one such analyst who believes a training presence in Ukraine by NATO forces is well worth considering. That's coming up a little later. But first, let's talk about the economy and those Stage 3 tax cuts overhauled by the Albanese government. They're certain to be delivered in pay packets from early July. Treasury Portfolio Minister Andrew Leigh is Assistant Minister for Competition, and he joins us in the studio. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Greg.
Andrew, tempted to ask if you've given any thought to what you'll do with your tax cuts, but I imagine it's something mundane like the rest of us. So the government, though, tactically seems a bit disappointed it sailed through so quickly. The Prime Minister and others have been baying in the House of Reps, where you are, for rapid passage all week, and then they got it last night. No delay, no examination. Is that a good thing or a bad thing from the government's point of view?
Delighted to see the strong support in the Parliament for our bigger, better, fairer tax cuts, Greg. We want Australians to earn more and keep more of what they earn. The Coalition, when we first announced our package, said that they'd roll it back. They said we should have an election, and then eventually they voted for it. That's all to the good. That means every Australian will get a tax cut, and it's particularly good for young Australians, 98% of whom will be better off under this package. No voter gratitude to speak of, as these things are tracked by at least two opinion polls, Newspoll and Resolve, this week. There's not much to measure, and surely that was a part of the original intention, particularly timed around the Dunkley by-election. Greg, I've paid no attention to horse race polls since I was an academic at ANU, writing papers as to the poor predictive power of polls. When I speak to my constituents, they believe that this package is a better one, it's a fairer one. It'll increase workforce participation. It won't place upward pressure on inflation because it'll increase workforce participation and deal with some of those supply chain blockages we've got through the economy.
That's the Treasury analysis, but speaking of inflation, we got the January figure out today. It was a little bit below market expectations at 3.4%. But then again, January is an extraordinary month, isn't it, with post-Christmas discounting. I think petrol also came down in the month of January. Should we reasonably expect the next movements to be upwards?
Well, Greg, you don't want to place as much emphasis on this figure, but I think for a different reason than you've articulated. That's because it's the monthly survey, which covers a smaller share of the basket of goods than the quarterly number. But it is reflecting the same results we're seeing in the quarterly figure, best inflation result for 2 years. It does suggest that the government's policies are working. The Bureau of Statistics has very clearly said that inflation would be higher were it not for our energy relief plans, our Commonwealth rent assistance, the important work that we're doing in other areas. So all of that is targeted towards dealing with inflation, and then at the very same time looking to make sure that we're getting productivity-driven real wage growth.
We'll come to productivity, and that's your work around competition in a moment. But just the narrow envelope that's left in not being positive to inflation growth between now and the May budget. There are further expectations of support in the near term so that people get something immediate, and then the tax cut in July. Just how narrow is that envelope? You don't have much room to manoeuvre, do you?
Well, the government's focused on increasing income support payments. We saw that through last year's budget. Significant increases, the changes to bulk billing, the cheaper medicines policy, all rolled out last year. And then on top of that now, we've got a tax cut for all Australians flowing through. And then supporting that, Greg, you've got our wages policy. We backed in a pay rise for aged care workers. We supported increases in the minimum wage. And you're seeing that reflected in figures such as the gender pay gap, which is now at a historic low of 12%, and we hope can be driven down lower still.
We're also seeing some analysis, it was through Freedom of Information documents earlier this week, from the Treasury showing that wages were contributing in a way greater than publicly reported anyway through the tail end of last year. Should people moderate their wage expectations now that inflation is dropping away?
Liberals like to pretend we're in a wage price spiral, but that's not serious economics. And the fact is the inflation pressure has not been driven by minimum wage workers asking to be paid what they're worth. It's been driven by supply chain problems which had built up under the former government, and of course the impact of the war in Ukraine. So we believe it is appropriate to see real wage growth. We're pleased we've now had 2 consecutive quarters of real wage growth after a former government for whom keeping wages low was a deliberate design feature of their economic architecture.
All right, let's move on to productivity and your work in the competition area. It's actually quite vast, so we won't even attempt to cover all of it, but there is one previously rather obscure area you're looking at, non-compete clauses. We've discussed it on this program, restraining the sharing of information or the movement of people from job to job. It turns out, because the ABS measured it, that it's used by almost half of employers in this country. How can governments outlaw this? Can it be done with a piece of legislation? How does the free market work when you arrive at a point of realisation that these are to the detriment of workers?
Well, freedom is exactly the right place to start here, Greg. Ultimately, non-compete clauses impede the freedom of workers to move to a better paying job. And we know that switching jobs tends to be the time in a worker's career when they get the biggest wage gains. Non-compete clauses have become ubiquitous through the economy, not just applying to executives, but to early childhood workers, security guards and yoga instructors. Used to be, we'd say that when a CEO moved from one job to another, they had to go on a period of gardening leave. Now gardening leave's being applied to gardeners. These clauses have become ubiquitous because standard form employment contracts have become commonplace, and they are potentially dampening wage growth. They're also potentially getting in the way of innovation, because if you're a new startup firm, you need talented workers, and non-compete clauses make it harder for you to get those workers. So the Competition Task Force is looking at it. They'll be reporting with an issues paper to government, and then we'll take measured decisions to work out the way forward, which might even involve working with states and territories as well.
I see, but what would the model be here? Would it be restraining or constraining their use, or banning them completely? Surely they must have a valid application in some circumstances where intellectual property is concerned and the like.
Well, we haven't landed on a settled model, Greg, but one fact that sticks in my mind is that in Silicon Valley, one of the most innovative places on the planet, non-compete clauses are banned under California state law. That hasn't stopped a whole lot of innovative startups, and in that jurisdiction, firms protect their confidential information directly rather than doing it indirectly through restraining worker mobility. So we've got a lot of stakeholders who are engaging on this. It's been a really productive and constructive process, and I do think there is a recognition that it is a strange state of affairs when so many Australian workers are constrained, including, say, hairdressers and security guards.
I hear you make the economic argument and the worker wage argument, but how would you counter when employers say, but this has real value to us, and that value is in retaining it as is? Would you just steamroller over the top of that with outlawing them?
Well, we never steamroll. We always engage constructively, but I wouldn't be surprised if incumbent employers wanted to hang on to their staff. But what's good for for a particular firm isn't necessarily good for the economy at large. If we had firms rules that block new entrants, then the incumbents might love it, but ultimately productivity and wage growth would suffer. So we need to encourage the growth of new firms. And if you look, Greg, at employing small businesses, then the start-up rate of employing small businesses has begun to slow over recent decades. That's a worry because that's a marker for the health of an economy. You need new dynamic firms starting up and growing. That's the source of prosperity for Australians in future decades. And we have, after all, just had the worst decade of productivity growth in the post-war era.
Well, exactly. And I know you are coming at those problems from all sorts of perspectives, way too many than we can possibly cover here today. But I promise we'll keep an eye on non-compete clauses with you and others as we move ahead. Andrew Lee, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, the government's now well down the list of ticking and passing its key election commitments into law. Stage 3 tax cuts as revised by them is only one example. The homeowner shared equity scheme Help to Buy looks to be in a bit of strife right now, though. Assistant Energy Minister Jenny McAllister joined us shortly after question time, and we began our discussion on that home buying scheme, which is meant to help up to 10,000 people a year, but itself is still a long way away from being delivered. Jenny McAllister, welcome back to the program. Can we start talking this week about Help to Buy, the shared equity scheme that was, I wouldn't call it a signature election commitment, but it was on the books for Labor. Debate's underway in the Reps and will soon head to the Senate, where I think it's fair to say it's well short of requisite support. Is the government committed to bringing this to a vote in the Senate?
Look, we are seeking support for this initiative, and you're right, we took it to an election, the public supported it, and we want to see support for it in both of the chambers in this place. This is a scheme that will help as many as 40,000 people who would otherwise not be able to enter home ownership get themselves a home. And this is such an important issue for Australians. I am yet to hear a credible reason from either the Greens or the Liberals for opposing this. The truth is that they should get out of the way and let us get on with the job of helping people with their housing needs.
I'm interested in the inevitable comparisons with the urgency and commitment to this with the Housing Australia Future Fund, where there was a standoff and eventually that was resolved through compromise. Whether this measure, Help to Buy, was blocked or halted by procedure, would the government treat that as a failure to pass with all the consequences that go with that and the Constitution?
I'm not going to speculate about a failure. I mean, our hope is that we get this through the Parliament. And the reason for that is because there are so many Australians that are depending on us to bring in really strong housing policies. This is just one of those issues that people talk to us about all the time, and our government is really committed to addressing it. So we have, as you know, an ambitious national target for new supply, but we also have programs like this that seek to support people into the market.
So committed that you would be prepared to negotiate any of the publicly stated sticking points that the Greens have. Obviously, negative gearing is one of those. They want it abolished or phased out, as rental caps and more public housing.
Well, none of those represent credible objections to the piece of legislation that is before them. There is a piece of legislation before them that will help people get into home ownership. And as I said, I am yet to hear a credible reason for voting against it. Really, this is just playing politics with something that's actually quite important.
All right, well, that's got a way to go through your chamber there in the Senate. Let's go to those gender pay gap figures released for the first time yesterday as a transparency measure. I think it's broadly been supported. There were a few quibbles from an LNP senator, but would you like to see further granular detail here? I noticed one criticism being made today is that rather than comparing, company to company against a benchmark of equity, why not go right down to like for like a male and a female worker in the same company doing the same job? Would that be a better measure of the pay gap?
We're trying to bring about a national debate about the pay gap. The publication of the details yesterday of the gender pay gaps of large Australian companies is a consequence of our legislation to make this data transparent that we took into the Parliament last year. And our purpose is to create more transparency so that boards can see what's going in the companies that they administer, so that employees can see what's going on in the companies that they work at, and so that women's organisations and the community more generally can make an assessment about the companies that they're engaging with and their commitment to gender pay. I think the system as legislated is already doing a good job at those things. The debate over the last 24 hours, I think, has been extremely positive. We do need to have a conversation about why men and women's lifetime earnings are so different. A conversation about the roles that they're performing in all of these workplaces is absolutely essential for that, to that end.
But that's not necessarily accounted for in these figures as they're aggregated around each company, are they? I mean, these indexes don't account for the fact that typically a woman, but not always a woman, will choose to do part-time work.
Well, choice is an interesting construction of the situation, isn't it? Because many of the jobs that are the most highly paid are not available on a part-time basis. And I'm not talking simply about very senior roles in white-collar jobs. I'm actually talking about some of the well-paid jobs in a range of sectors, like the construction sector, where the amount of availability of part-time work is quite limited. What we are seeking is for companies to think carefully about the steps that they can take in their own organisations to make a wider range of roles available to women and to ensure that some of the gender pay gaps that we're seeing in the statistics that have been published can be improved.
Yeah.
And I think the public conversation about this over the last 24 hours has been extremely positive.
No, it has generally been, and I guess the proof now will lie in the behavioural response by these companies around recruitment and promotion, but I guess that's going to take some time to measure. Let's move on to climate matters in your portfolio, Jenny McAllister. A poll out this week showed levels of support, some might say surprising levels of support for nuclear power with across the board, regardless of your voting background or in some cases age, about 50 to 51% support. How do you explain that? And do you agree that it's higher than would generally be perceived in this country?
Look, I think the issue here is whether or not the technology is actually going to meet the challenge that's before us. And the conversation that I'm having with the community when people talk to me about it, it runs along these lines. AEMO tells us that we need substantial investment in new generation between now and 2035 to replace ageing coal-fired power stations that are coming to the end of their life. Nuclear is unlikely to be available under the most optimistic estimates until well after that time frame. It is not a technology that suits Australian circumstances. It is expensive. And it's also a technology that I think many Australians, notwithstanding the polling that you're pointing to, do feel anxious about. This is not a technology that suits our specific circumstances, and frankly, the obsession with this technology by the opposition represents a distraction.
You don't think there's a generational shift here, because obviously younger people in their 20s, for instance, won't be as aware or haunted by the Cold War 1970s nuclear power reactor meltdowns that happened in the US and a bit later in Russia. Do you think there is a failure and a lack of appreciation around that? It just doesn't register with younger people.
From my perspective, the issues are time, cost, and in particular relative cost next to the technologies that we know will work in the Australian context. I mean, the advice is very clear. Nuclear energy exceeds the cost of renewables that are firmed by something like 4 times. This is not a sensible cost choice for Australians, and nor will it be ready in the time frame that is available. It
could make it ahead of 2050, though, couldn't it? I mean, that's broadly asserted by the coalition, that it's not a help to 2030 and it's not a help to 2035 targets, but it could be by 2050.
I think we're looking at the cost profile. When you've got one technology that costs 4 times as much as firmed renewables, Why would we go down that path? And the answer is because Peter Dutton is looking for any opportunity to distract from the fact that despite having 22 energy policies whilst they were last in government, they have got none at the moment.
All right, well, we await details of their forthcoming policy. We're told it's a work in progress, which means we'll be able to take a look at that with you at a future occasion when it emerges. Jenny McAllister, you've got a bit on at the moment with Parliament sitting. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Now, an update's just come to hand on a story that we covered here yesterday and has been covered widely concerning this weekend's Mardi Gras in Sydney and the disinvitation of New South Wales Police to hold or to participate in it. It's been the subject of further discussion today, and some statements have just come to hand. The New South Wales Police Commissioner, Karen Webb, has had talks with the Mardi Gras board, and this statement just out says that they've reached agreement for police officers from the New South Wales Force to participate, but they'll be doing it in reduced numbers, the statement says, from the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras board. Also, it has been determined that to address concerns from the community, participating officers in this year's parade will do so out of uniform, and that was a discretion that was available to the New South Wales Police Commissioner. So there are other elements to their statement. We might come back to that in a subsequent interview that we do have lined up here in Canberra, but that news just to hand. Something of a compromise settled there for a New South Wales Police Force involvement in the Mardi Gras. Now, drawing attention to your causes can be tough to do when sitting on the crossbench of the lower house under a majority government here in Canberra. Of course, all that means is you have to work harder and be creative. And on that score, Bob Katter and Andrew Wilkie have really lifted their game to new levels today. Both are vitally concerned about supermarket giants Coles and Woolworths dominating the grocery market, and Bob Katter has a bill that would seek to force these companies to sell off hundreds of their stores. As it stands, the two companies are posting mammoth underlying profits, and from where Bob and Andrew sit on the crossbench, well, that looks an awful lot like pigs with snouts in troughs.
We're going to be talking about the supermarket and how to rein them in. It's going to be Bob's right-hand man.
Are we just going to continue with them screwing the farmers down through the floor and charging the consumers $1 squillion?
If this bill could be passed into law, that each year for 5 years, both Woolworths and Coles would have to divest themselves of 5% of their market share. In other words, 5% Woolies, 5% Coles, that's 10% a year. So over 5 years, Woolies and Coles would go from around 70% down to about 20%. Some people might say, well, this is very dramatic, you know, forcing divestiture by law. Well, yes, it is dramatic, because pussyfooting around this for years and decades has not worked.
Not another country in the world has anything like the concentration, where you've got, 90% of the market held by the big two. And I'm not plucking figures out of the air. The last time it was done was 2001.
Well, they certainly got their point across, didn't they? I don't know about you. I could have lived without disturbance with the physical imagery of them in the pig suits, but it was the sound effects of the snorting in the troughs that got to me most of all. Let's move on, though. Speaking of crossbenchers, Victorian Independent Helen Haines took a shot earlier this week at putting more controls on ministers who try to pork barrel with grants and infrastructure for pet projects in pet electorates. Again, because of the numbers and outright command of them by the government, she'll find it hard for her private members' bill to gain traction in the House. But there could be another way to progress this. We caught up with Helen Haines on that and supermarket pricing too. Helen Haynes, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. So private members' bills, I think we're pretty well aware, tend to have a fairly short shelf life. You tabled one on Monday to do with ending pork barrelling. We'll get to its chance for a second life in another place in a moment. But just to back things up, for those who weren't following it earlier in the week, the key features of your private members' bill on pork barrelling?
Well, let me start by saying I think I am the private member who is the exception to the rule when it comes to private members' bills, Greg. I'm sure your listeners would know the amount of work that I did in getting a National Anti-Corruption Commission onto the top of the agenda at the last election, and that was through work in tabling private members' bills. I did it twice with the same bill. So we had a problem then with corruption. We had a problem then with an integrity framework for this federal parliament, and that work is not complete. Part of that work really means addressing this egregious problem that we've had for many, many years with major parties making promises to voters at election time on big infrastructure projects which really are about political need, not about community need. So I want to fix that. I've put to the Parliament what I think is a pretty modest bill that puts a solid reporting framework, transparency elements and accountability when ministers are spending taxpayers' money on grants.
And critically, just on that last point, if ministers deviated from the recommended list of projects, if you like, for grants, then they would have to inform the public.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to deal the Parliament back in to the transparency of how taxpayers' dollars are spent, because right now we don't have a uniform process when it comes to publicly available selection criteria. So we might have guidelines around the grants, but we don't really know how the decisions are made in terms of who gets selected to have a grant. So I think that's got to be transparent, and I think that when the department makes recommendations to a minister and the minister has the final say, I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't, but when they make a decision that is contrary to what the department, who's gone through all of that selection criteria and guidelines, then that minister should front up to the Parliament and explain why, and to do so in a timely manner. Right now we only find out about these things when we have an Auditor General report, which can be years later.
Yeah, now I know hope springs eternal for your own private members' bill in the lower house, as difficult as that might be, but it does always help to have friends in high places, or in this case in other places. You have one in Senator David Pocock. In what way might he assist you to advance this argument, if not the meat and potatoes of your bill itself?
So, Greg, like me, Senator Pocock cares deeply about integrity and about rebuilding the trust of the general public in our federal parliament. All the crossbenchers do, actually, and it's crossbenchers who bring these kind of bills to the parliament on a regular basis. Sophie Scomps, Jobs for Mates, Zali Steggall, Truth in Political Advertising. So, you know, we have a track record of doing this. Senator Pocock, though, is in a position where in the Senate there is a bill that will be debated later in the week, which is around grants. Senator Pocock is planning to amend that government bill with my bill, so to bring in that whole piece of legislation for debate. The other element that I think is really encouraging about this is that our Finance Minister, Senator Gallagher, I know she cares deeply about this too. She, in opposition, put forward her own private members' bill about improving the transparency and accountability of grants. So her bill is still there too.
Okay, it doesn't mean she'll accept David Pocock's adoption, if you like, of your recommendations. We've heard plenty of arguments from others, principally the coalition in the Parliament, why they wouldn't want to be supporting suggestions such as
Well, I think we've got plenty of evidence why they wouldn't want to. Yeah. I mean, we've got so much evidence of, you know, there's thousands of grants administered every year, Greg, billions of dollars spent, and look, you know, we have got a litany of rorts that happened in the previous Parliament under the coalition government. I can see why they don't want that to change.
Yes, and a lot of their arguments are against diluting the discretion or power of ministers. I'm more curious, though, particularly since you reference Katie Gallagher, what the government's arguments, if they've ever been expressed to you, what their reservations or objections might be to your proposal.
Yeah, so I'm having conversations conversations with members of the government now, and I'm having fruitful conversations. I've had a fruitful conversation with Senator Gallagher this morning. I think that concern around the power of a minister is a real one. I would argue, though, that this in fact protects a minister. There is good reason why a minister may wish to make a decision that's different to a departmental advice. What I'm saying is protect yourself, come out to the Parliament and explain why. I'm sure there's very good reasons for that. This is also, you know, a classic case of preventative medicine. Sure. If a minister is inclined to think I might give a little bit of advantage to a marginal seat coming into an election, they're going to think twice about that, Greg, because ultimately we all suffer when pork barrelling is allowed to flourish.
We'll watch the progress, if any, as David Pocock tries to lend a helping hand to some of your endeavours there, Helen Haines. Can I take you also to supermarkets? You'd be well aware today, in fact, I think much of Australia is, we saw the spectacle of Bob Catter and Andrew Wilkie dressed up as pigs. They're trying to tackle the question of market concentration with the suggestion that divestiture powers should be there to break down the Coles-Woolies market share, stretches well above 70% now. Do you support that? I'm thinking particularly about the peculiarities of supermarket and grocery stores in regional areas. Would you support a breakup? Would that help the situation in your area?
Look, I think what we've got, and it's really good that I'm sitting here as a rural and regional MP who represents a lot of farmers and a lot of food production. And what I've seen and what we know to be true is that we've seen farmers really screwed down in terms of prices that they can receive from the two major supermarkets in contrast to the costs of production and the profits that they receive as primary producers. That's really problematic. I think you've heard the National Farmers Federation talk about that on many occasions. I think we've got a real problem in rural and regional Australia where we don't have small independent supermarkets. So, you know, there we are producing the food. The only choice we have is to buy from Coles or Woolies. That's a very peculiar situation, really unique to Australia. In terms of divestiture powers, I am really eager to see what this review that the government has stood up will say about that. I like to make a decision based on good evidence. Can we do it? How would we do it? Certainly Mr Wilkie and Mr Catter have given some compelling reasons today with evidence from other countries. So I'm really open to this. I think everything should be on the table. We do need to do everything in our power to reduce the cost of living for everyday Australians. And the grocery shop is the big expense, the handing over the money every single week.
I'm sure your memory goes back far enough to remember a time when there were smaller owned independent grocery stores. That wasn't exactly a heyday on affordability either, was it?
No.
Back in the day, many of those were accused of price gouging as well. So,
Greg, I'm so old. I am so experienced that I have very strong memories of the local grocer coming to our farm with a box of groceries on his shoulder. In those days, there was very little choice. Again, seasonal produce was what you grew at home. And of course, if you were in the city, not on a farm, you couldn't do that. So, you know, it's easy sometimes to be misty-eyed about the past. But I think what we have in the present is a system that is not working for everyday Australians. And I'm very enthusiastic about us doing something about that.
All right. Well, I know the government would argue if it was here that it's got a number of reviews underway. We'll see where that lands. And as we said earlier, Helen Haines, keep an eye on progress around your pork barrelling bill too.
Please do.
Great to have you back.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, let's bring in our political panel now, and it's one that spans both chambers in the Parliament. From the lower house, Labor MP Josh Burns is with us. Welcome back, Josh. And Liberal frontbencher from the Senate, Anne Ruston. Welcome to you too, Anne. Why don't we start with Help to Buy, where debate has, got underway in the House, Josh. I'm intrigued by the time it gets to where Anne is in the Senate. Will the government push this as hard as it did with the Housing Australia Future Fund in the absence of Greens support?
Greg, it boggles the mind that the Greens have decided to declare that they won't support a program that will allow people on medium incomes to get into the housing market with only a 2% deposit, people who are earning $90,000 or couples who are earning up to $120,000. These are not people who are exorbitantly wealthy Australians. And this program, like the one in Victoria, like the one in WA, is designed to help more people get into the housing market. Now, we know the Liberal Party has said no to every single measure that we have put in to build more homes or to help with the housing market. They said no to 30,000 social homes. They said no to 4,000 homes for women and children fleeing domestic violence. They said no to homes for our veterans. They've said no to everything, and now the Greens have joined them in this unholy alliance to say no to people who are able to try and get into the housing market.
But if it was compared, and it's hard not to make this comparison with the Housing Australia Future Fund, your government didn't have much hesitation in taking that halfway towards what would have been, didn't happen in the end, a double dissolution election trigger. Are you that committed to this?
Greg, if you speak to anyone, any young person, any young professional in Macnamara about what the likelihood of them trying to be able to own their own home is, it's so hard right now. It's so hard. And that's why we're trying to build more homes. That's why we're trying to create more homes for people who are in the social housing end of the housing spectrum. And it's why we've got this program which will literally help thousands of Australians get into the housing market and buy their own home with only a 2% deposit, and the government will help subsidise that. It's a scheme that will mean Australians will have more stability in their own home and will be able to buy a home in areas that they want to live in.
All right, that's the argument for it. And Rustin, on another analysis, the number that it would assist in any given year is 10,000 and 40,000 over 4. Once you spread that across the entire nation and then regions and cities as well, it could almost be regarded at that scale as a pilot scheme, wouldn't it? On that basis, why not support it and see whether it works or not?
Well, look, a couple of things here. I mean, firstly, these schemes are already in place in some of the states, and we've seen, like in the case of New South Wales, 94% of the places that were on offer still haven't been taken up. So I'd question whether people actually want more influence of the government in their lives. I would suggest that they probably don't want them involved in their mortgage, let alone, you know, in the rest of their lives. But I'd also say that you know, there are ways in which, you know, Australians, I'm sure, you know, the government can put in place programs that will work for Australians to make sure home ownership is not something that's just a dream into the future. And, you know, we support the idea of Australians owning their own home, which was why we put in the home ownership, yeah, the home guarantee scheme when we were in government to help Australians get into their homes. And I'd just like to just make one comment that I found a little bit offensive from Josh's comments, was around that we would stand in the way of women who are escaping domestic violence from being able to have a home over their head. When I was the Social Services Minister, I put in place a program and oversaw a program that allowed 7,000 women and their children every year to be able to get access to emergency accommodation and homes when they were escaping domestic violence, as well as putting in place the emergency payment scheme for domestic violence.
No, thanks for pointing that out.
I just think you should be a little careful if you're going to play these political games that you don't overreach on.
That was in reference, I think, not to Help to Buy, but in
that was the Housing Australia Future Fund, which the Liberal Party voted against, which was going to construct 4,000 homes for women and children fleeing domestic violence. So it's a fact. It's not overreach.
Okay, let's go to gender pay gap with the data out yesterday. I might start with you, Anne. A number of senior coalition figures have distanced themselves from Matt Canavan, who described this index or this data as useless. Were his comments unhelpful?
Well, what I'd like to say is that, you know, obviously as a woman in the workforce, I'd like to see that we're seeing more women in higher paid jobs, and that's the way we are going to close the gender pay gap, is making sure that we've got a pipeline of women who are doing STEM subjects, as an example, because we know that those sorts of jobs, you know, the engineering jobs, the maths and science jobs are the ones that are paying higher pay. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to put in place those pipelines and opportunities for women to get the higher paying jobs, because that's how we close the gender pay gap. So,
but what's the value? What's the value in the data, though, and how will that change hiring behaviour or promotion behaviour within any of the companies listed?
Well, I'd like to think that if you were comparing yourself against one of your competitors and they were doing better at making sure that they had a gender pay gap that was continually reducing, that may inspire other companies to do the same thing. But we also have to recognise that, you know, this is about choice, and we've got to make sure that choice is available to women so that they can get those higher paying jobs, because we want to encourage them to actually go into that pathway and program for that to happen.
There are many factors, aren't there, behind the gender pay gap, Josh Burns. Is discrimination one of them?
clearly. And that's why we brought in measures to make sure that companies who are employing more than 100 people had to publicly report on whether they were paying their male employees who are doing exactly the same job as their female employees the same amount. And the data that we've seen is making it clear for everyone which companies have a really good record, which companies have pay parity, but where there are far more companies who are paying their male employees more than their female employees. And I think it is really astonishing that we've got people in the coalition like Matt Canavan who are doubling down on this sort of outdated dinosaur thinking of somehow, targeting this idea that women and men shouldn't be paid the same. I know Anne thinks that women and men should be paid the same, but her party and this coalition of these people are putting out this, frankly, culture war. And I was impressed by the comments of Susan Lee, who really condemned this, but we've had silence from Peter Dutton thus far. Yeah, well, there has been a bit of a clamour for further detail to be built into this, an expanded data set in the future. We might see if it evolves. Private health insurance, and Rustin, I think you've led the charge with the allegation that perhaps the government, through the health minister, might be dragging its heels on the latest approvals of premium increases because of the Dunkley election. And yet the minister said today what he's doing totally accords with past practice for these approvals. They are generally late February, early March. That rather punctures that argument, doesn't it?
No, not at all. In the last term of the government, that when Greg Hunt was the health minister, we managed to put in place some of the lowest premium increases, in fact the lowest premium increases, and every time Greg Hunt made the announcement in relation to premium increases, they were made in December. So what the minister's saying is absolutely wrong.
But isn't the industry also saying it can live with an announcement soonish, but they've certainly got days and weeks. They don't seem too perturbed that it hasn't happened yet.
Well, I'm not particularly concerned about the industry. What I'm concerned about is the people of Australia, the 14 million of them that have currently got private health insurance, who are doing it really tough with cost of living pressures. Every dollar counts, and somehow they've got to try and make budgetary decisions between now and the 1st of April when this information isn't being made available to them. And I would just question why the minister is not releasing this data, because if he doesn't release the data by Saturday, which is the Dunkley by-election, this will be the latest time that this information has been released for 15 years. So I would absolutely have to question one of two things. The minister's just not doing his job in negotiating, or he's holding this information back. And I hope the people of Dunkley don't get a surprise next week when they find out that they've actually got increases that are much higher than they were expecting.
Well, that could well happen, couldn't it, Josh Burns? No decision before Saturday, and then a 4, 5, who knows, % increase in average premiums.
Greg, in December, what the Minister for Health did was push back against the private health insurers because the deal that they were proposing wasn't in the national interest. Their profits have gone up, but their services have been diminished, and the return for the Australian people was not good enough. So what did Mark Butler do? He pushed back. Now, if the Liberal Party wants to cheer for, higher health premiums and lower return for Australians, well then, they can do that. What we're doing is making sure that the health insurance companies actually deliver value. The other thing that we're doing is actually investing in our universal Medicare system through things like the urgent care clinic, including one in my electorate. We're investing in cheaper medicines, and we're investing in bulk billing, increasing bulk billing for especially concession card holders, for those people who can't even afford private health insurance. So they're the things we're doing, and we'll keep doing that, and we'll make sure that Australians get a good deal, especially on private health insurance.
Quick final one for you and Rustin. I'm sure you have your eye across medical rates of inflation, the general CPI. What seems an appropriate figure? Premiums are going to be higher, right? They're maybe not going to be 6, but is 4?
Well, obviously I'm not privy to the kind of information that the minister is, and all I can say is that I just think that the government should be providing people under a time when they're under incredible pressure, that they should be giving them this information. And also say it's interesting, Josh, I mean, I believe that your electorate's got the highest amount of doctors per capita, and yet you've got an urgent care clinic. Maybe we should be considering putting some of these extra services in places where there aren't so many GPs.
All right, hold that.
We have an urgent care clinic because we have a lot of social housing residents and people who can't afford to go to a GP, and making sure that they have high bulk billing rates, and I absolutely support them getting free medicine.
We'll track the rollout of further urgent care clinics and maybe come back to this and other matters. The other side of Dunkley. And Rustin, Josh Burns,
Thanks,
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, there was a moment in Europe overnight where French President Emmanuel Macron seemed to invite an examination of NATO troop involvement in the war in Ukraine. That's been unthinkable for the last 2 years, but our regular analyst on military matters, retired Australian Army General Mick Ryan, is in Eastern Canada at the moment. He thinks a discussion on this is at least worth having. Well, Mick Ryan, we find you in the Northern Hemisphere this week, which probably puts you that little bit closer to events unfolding in Europe. You'd be well aware by now that Emmanuel Macron has held that high-level meeting with European counterparts. The UK were there, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands and others. There's still some ambiguity, I think, Mick, about the French position, but Emmanuel Macron did say there's no consensus to officially back any ground troops from NATO countries going into the Ukraine war. Then he went on to say nothing should be excluded. Now, is this just a thought bubble from the French president or a serious insight into future considerations?
Well, g'day, Greg. It's hard to know whether it's a deliberate strategy to confuse and deceive the Russians. That is not a bad thing. But at the end of the day, Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has come out and said, hey, listen, NATO's not deploying troops in there. But also, he didn't rule it out. So I think it's not a bad thing. It gives them wriggle room to deploy trainers into Ukraine if they wish to do that, either as NATO or individual countries. And it kind of puts the Russians in a bit of a dilemma about NATO. And that, too, is not a bad thing.
And would you see military sense in that escalation? And it would be an escalation, even if you called them trainers. This would be a red flag, wouldn't it, to Moscow?
Well, the Russians certainly wouldn't like it, but they've issued similar responses when the West has discussed sending in HIMARS, when it's discussed sending in F-16s in tanks. So this is a pretty standard response from the Kremlin at the moment. Sending in trainers makes eminent sense. It can turn around people much more quickly for the battlefield, but also can allow us to learn the lessons of Ukraine much more quickly than what we're doing at the moment. Very few Western militaries are able to do that firsthand.
At the same time, though, Mick, would it risk, even just flying this balloon, risk exposing splits within the cohesion of Europe or more broadly NATO? German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was very quick to be cool on the idea publicly. He scotched it, basically. Couldn't Russia and Vladimir Putin exploit this perception of splits and differences?
Well, I think they've been doing that for 2 years. Whilst there's been remarkable unity from NATO on many issues, there's been others, such as the tank debate and others, where there has been splits, and I have no doubt that Russian misinformation has sought to exploit that. There's no surprise, really, that the German Chancellor would come out with this kind of statement. It is very forward-leaning from the French president. I think there's some way to go before there's any consensus on any kind of deployment of any NATO personnel into Ukraine.
Yeah, understood. Look, the mere holding of this meeting and some of the public statements made afterwards hint at, I would have thought, Mick, deep frustration among European leaders about progress in Ukraine. And also, I think they publicly said that there's a recognition by them they might have to pick up the slack in military donations if additional US aid is further delayed. Have they that capacity?
Well, Europe is a very industrialised continent, and they certainly have the capacity to expand the production of munitions and equipment that the Ukrainians need. It's really about will. It's not about money. They certainly have the wealth to do that. And picking up the slack from the Americans, you can't do that overnight. That will take some time to do. But the Europeans stepping up defence production and defence spending is no bad thing.
All right, but that's obviously not in the calculations that are happening around Washington, D.C. at the moment. I mean, the US isn't holding back, is it, to encourage Europe to step forward? Do you see any resolutions there in Washington? I know the President, Biden, has had the big four around for further discussions. No progress seems to have been made that we can see so far.
It's very difficult to see progress on the Ukraine support package in the short term, given, the crocodile closest to the boat for the Americans now is funding government. Now, there's several funding bills that the administration needs to discuss with Congress over the next week or so. That's what will be their focus. And unfortunately, Ukraine again will slip to the end of the line.
All right, one more on NATO before we go directly to Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership. Sweden has joined NATO, officially acceding and expanding the membership there. What is the significance of their entry? Sometime in the making, but it's there now.
Yeah, this is a very positive development this week. Like we said, it's taken some while to convince at least one country to allow them to accede. What Sweden brings is a very capable and professional military, a very capable and high-tech defence industry. But the Swedes have also got lessons for the West in mobilising their people, as well as combating Russian misinformation. So they bring a capable military institution, a willing political partner, as well as lessons for the rest of us.
All right. Look, let's go to Ukraine directly. And as that second anniversary of the invasion came around, Mick, Volodymyr Zelensky openly confronted what all Ukrainian officials, himself included, have steadfastly avoided for 2 years now, and that is a declaration of the number of war dead casualties on the Ukrainian side. 31,000 was the number, of course. Why is he doing this now?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons he's done this, Greg. I think he's realised that he can no longer lack transparency in these kind of figures. So he's been asked this for 2 years running. He's realised he's the leader of a democracy. These kind of things should be open to scrutiny. But more politically, he is not yet able to get the mobilisation bill through the Ukrainian parliament. He really needs to do so. The Ukrainian military are desperate to mobilise more people, and I think it's part of their campaign to convince lawmakers to pass that mobilisation bill.
And why is he struggling with that? If you're in the midst of a war and you've lost 31,000 of your citizens, why is it not a cohesive no-brainer for everyone involved in Ukrainian politics?
Yeah, you would think so, but speaking to several Ukrainians today, their sense is this is a return to normal for politics for many Ukrainian politicians who are insulated from the war in Kiev. That's part of it. But there's also concerns that the Ukrainian military has sometimes not used their people well, like in the Battle of Bakhmut. That is a perception. I'm not sure that's always been reality. So there are multiple reasons why the parliament is yet to pass this mobilisation bill. And to be honest, the Ukrainian president hasn't given its wholesome support that he might have as well.
OK. Well, on the battlefield, though, Mick, are we to take seriously, after some recent retreats, talk of a Ukrainian counter-offensive? And if so, where?
Yeah, I think this was even more surprising in that talk than the mention of 31,000 killed in action from Ukraine. I don't think anyone was really expecting the Ukrainians to have the capacity for a ground counter-offensive this year. I think what he has directed General Sierski to do is undertake limited attacks to make sure they preempt larger Russian offensive operations this summer and to limit any territorial gains they got. Anything more than that would be extraordinarily difficult for the Ukrainians to do this year, given their shortfalls in people and munitions.
Yeah, they definitely seem to have some things stacked against them at present. None of it is going to be resolved in the near term, Mick, which means we might be able to check in with you next week and see what, if any, changes have occurred. In the meantime, thanks for joining us there from Canada.
No worries. Thanks, Greg.
Well, as we mentioned, at around this time yesterday, federal police had joined New South Wales police at that time in deciding to sit out this year's Mardi Gras happening this weekend in Sydney. Both got to those positions for different reasons, and then we mentioned about 20 minutes ago that there's been a bit of an update to this, with a meeting having occurred between New South Wales police and organisers of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. Liberal Senator Dean Dean Smith had been keeping an eye on this for reasons that he might soon explain to us. He joins us now live in the studio. Senator, welcome back. Yes, the update we brought to our audience only in the last 15 or 20 minutes ago was from the board of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, saying New South Wales police officers will participate in this year's parade in a reduced capacity to the originally planned full float, and that they will also be participating out of uniform. Does that address any concerns you might have had about the decision to uninvite them?
Well, as you alluded to, Greg, I do speak from a unique position, not only as a parliamentarian who is a member of the LGBTI community, but as the son of a police officer and the brother of a police officer in the West Australian Police Force. So I hope that this is a decision that will be welcomed, not just by the LGBTI community, but by the broader Australian community. I think it does speak to the high level of cooperation and unity that has characterised New South Wales policing and LGBTI matters for a number of years now. I'm sure it will not satisfy everyone, but I think that we can trust the cooperation and that sort of the decision to keep a close eye on the importance of demonstrating unity at Saturday's march. So I welcome the decision.
Obviously, we are awaiting word, and I imagine it is being considered right now by the Australian Federal Police, whether they would follow suit and restore some sort of contingent presence in this weekend's Mardi Gras. Any views on where this leaves them?
Well, I can't see a compelling reason why the Australian Federal Police will not follow the decision, the agreement that's been reached by New South Wales Police and the Mardi Gras organisers. I do think that police forces across our country should be acting in a uniform and cooperative way. And again, it speaks to the cooperation and unity that both Mardi Gras and the New South Wales Police have established. So I welcome the New South Wales Police decision, but I also hope that the Australian Federal Police will follow suit.
As you alluded to in your first answer, Dean, there are historical reasons for some tensions, I suppose, between the gay and lesbian community around Sydney, with a special commission of inquiry having been held in that state. And then there are more recent events, obviously the tragic killing of Luke Davies and Jessie Baird. When some of the more immediate pressure points have dissipated, do you in general think it a healthy thing that formal police presence via a float is a regular fixture at these events?
Well, again, people's attitudes to the Sydney Mardi Gras are varied. When I look at the Mardi Gras, I see a demonstration of Australia's commitment to anti-discrimination measures. I'm not someone who finds the Mardi Gras offensive. I'm not offended by the political statements that some people choose to make. It is a free country. But for me, what I see in the Mardi Gras events are Australia's commitment to ending discrimination, a greater acceptance of LGBTI people across our community in every forum.
All right. Well, look, thank you for putting that on the record and coming at it, at least in the federal parliament, from what I imagine is a unique perspective for the reasons that you outlined. Why don't we just switch over to your daily work on committees here? And you are behind a coalition bill called Pay on Delay that would seek to impose penalties on airlines when they seriously delayed or cancelled in this country. Why not leave this to the ACCC, which has already got a few broad policies in this area?
Well, I think, Greg, you won't be surprised to hear me say that the government's reaction so far to sort of meeting the increasing levels of demand for better service from airline consumers has been characterised by inertia and defensiveness. I think the context is very, very important. In December last year, 5 million commercial flights in Australia. In December last year, 5.5% level of cancellations, double the average. And of course, we've seen in the most recent ACCC report an almost 200% increase in the number of complaints to airlines. So clearly, Australian airline consumers are demanding action. I'm delighted that Senator Mackenzie and myself have put before the Parliament a bill that will bring some of those questions to final resolution.
Just finally, we don't have a lot of time left, but there'd be a pile of exemptions, wouldn't there, before a penalty was actually paid to a passenger? For instance, uncontrollable weather events, air traffic delays, circling around a city. All of that would have to be taken care of, wouldn't it?
Well, one of those things is not within the control of the government, and that is the weather. The other is absolutely in control of the government. Air Services Australia is a government agency. So I think the government has a greater level of responsibility on this issue than it wants to accept at the moment, and we hope that our bill will put a change to that.
All right, well, bills initiated from your side of the parliament are pretty hard going, but...
to be fair though, Greg, to be fair, Senator Mackenzie and I had some recent success just a few months ago with a similar bill to force the government to reintroduce ACCC monitoring regime. And we had some success.
All right, well, that one's chalked up on the board. We wish you good luck with whatever lies ahead on that one. Dean Smith, really appreciate you coming back on to the program.
Thank you.
And with that farewell, we are going to wrap up on Afternoon Briefing. Our team will be back with you at the regular time tomorrow. Joe O'Brien and the rest of the ABC News team are up with you next.